when you're doing a hand transplant, the team that's working are basically hand surgeons. Dr. Marvin is, I'm calling him, saying, I got to make sure I'm giving the right medications and all of that. The actual number of people, I think there were 5 staff. Six. Okay. If I get this wrong, there was Dr. Kutz, Dr. Benegas, Schecker, Marino, and Palazzo.
And yourself.
And myself. And then there were 14 fellows, those who are in training, who are around the world. And we rotate. Well, when we start, for example, you need 8 surgeons working at the same time because you have the 2 donor arms and you have the recipient there with both of his arms, and then that goes on for a number of hours, and then you're down to 2 teams. And if you're doing it at 28 hours or something, we're rotating people constantly. So it's a big team. It's one of the advantages that Louisville has is we have a lot of firepower in terms of microsurgical skill and reconstructive extremity skill.
How much notification do you all have on the donor possibility?
It's like every donor. It was about 24 hours. So we follow the exact same protocol that goes for liver or kidney. And I probably should mention at this time, this can't take place without a dance that takes place between the hand surgeons, the transplant surgeons, and CODA. If you want to put a stranglehold on doing any of this, you just lose one of those. And we probably should have remember that some families suffered in order to make sure another family got something. And I would like to ask Jenny Jones maybe to come up and talk a little bit about CODA and the role they play on this. CODA has been extremely helpful to me, and I want to just roll this back. Can you imagine if you're running an organ procurement program where you're trying to convince people at a time of severe grief to give up some body part, and into your office walks somebody who says, I want to do a hand transplant, it's never been done, and I need you to help me ask families to obtain something that we don't even know it'll work. And CODA didn't blink at that. They've worked from the very beginning with me in pushing this forward. So as that little introduction, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for CODA.
Thank you, Dr. Breidenbach. Jenny Jones with CODA, Kentucky Organ Donor Affiliates. And as Dr. Breidenbach and Dr. Marvin both referenced, none of this could take place without our donors, those individuals willing to help others through donation as well as their families. And I think many of us may wonder what happens when we renew our driver's license and we say yes to getting on the donor registry. What happens when we have that conversation with our next of kin, our loved ones, our family? A lot of us don't have that conversation because we're afraid to discuss death. But what if we do have that conversation and say to them, yeah, I want to be an organ tissue donor when I die if I can help anybody out? And I think today is a perfect culmination of seeing how helpful it is for just one individual to say yes to organ tissue donation and how many subsequent individuals are helped by this one decision. So from our standpoint, just being able to know that the wishes of this particular individual were carried out, and it's just so helpful if the family does know what someone's wishes were. So I can't say enough about this donor registry that the state of Kentucky now has, and pushing forth that effort to make sure individuals are aware of the donor registry. But it is just incredible, and I think that all the teams that were involved in this particular transplant certainly need to be thanked and commended, and all of us also need to remember, as Dr. Breidenbach just mentioned, that family who is now without their loved one, but they were able to leave this legacy.
The cost to us is about $300,000. And that is research money that initially was funded by Jewish Hospital, and then as we began to gain steam from that initial investment on the first several patients, we now have grant money from the Department of Defense. And the amount of grant money from the Department of Defense has been increasing around the country. There's a number of teams who are getting money now, and there are 14 different universities who are starting investigational programs or in the process of trying to get there, including Mayo Clinic, University of Pennsylvania, Emory, a lot of other places, University of Texas. Now, the long-term cost, maybe I should refer that to Dr. Marvin, because we cover the expense completely for the patient during that first 3 months, and then we pass them off to their private insurance just as though they were a transplant. And then they're on long-term immunosuppression, and if they have complications, they need to be covered. And I don't know what the lifetime cost is for a kidney transplant.
I think the costs are very variable, and it depends on the incidence of complications. If patients don't have complications, the costs are relatively low. The medications are very expensive, and it's actually a chronic problem for transplants from any of any organ or tissue, and that requires immunosuppression, and that is that the cost of these drugs are very high, and that often insurance companies will cover up to a certain point. Especially some of the government insurance companies, they cover up to a certain point, and then patients can fall into a donut hole or a time when their medicines aren't covered for a period of time. And medication coverage for transplant is a big issue, and the costs are exceedingly variable, depending on the complications.
And when you said $300,000 is the cost to us, you mean us, Jewish Hospital and the University of Louisville and Kleinert Kutz team, or?
Yes, that's the cost, approximately, that we need to get the patient from point A through the surgery, his immunosuppression, the physical therapy, the biopsies, and to the 3-month period. And that right now, we've been fortunate in getting grants from the Department of Defense to investigate this. And then after that, most of the cost is then passed on to the insurance. Although if we're doing something that's investigational, if we're drawing bloods or doing a biopsy on the patient, which is considered research, we still have to put that under our research grant.
And so are you hoping to get soldiers who need these transplants?
Well,
the ultimate goal?
Yeah, I'd love to have a soldier. We've had some soldiers who have come to us, but it's our screening process is very rigorous. And also, people come and they think they want a hand, but when they hear of the complications and everything else that they have to go through, they say no. So yes, we have had some soldiers who have come here. We would eventually like to transplant a soldier, just because this technology coincides with a shift in the type of military injuries that we're all aware of now, their face and extremities. And this technology obviously would help those soldiers. The more we learn about it, the more we'll be able to help them. Well, the recovery will be along the same lines. What's going to be frustrating for him is he's going to be very incapacitated because he's got both hands involved. And, if you're doing a single hand transplant, you still got one hand that can take care of your activities of daily living. You're toileting yourself. When you've got both hands tied up in braces, you're going to be paralyzed for a while. And they're going to be in braces, complicated braces, for 6 weeks, and then into an easier, more functional brace after that. For home run would be a patient who, on our functional scores, ended up getting 80 to 90% of his function back and how we measure it, and would get normal feeling and some of the fine motor motion back, and return to all activities of daily living, and have reasonably good grip strength. I don't think all of those have ever been achieved in any hand transplant. Their hands are normally weak, and there's been very few that have gotten those fine motor function back in their hand. There have been some. Our first patient has some of the fine motor, but it's certainly not perfect.